Hello, this is Darren Pulsifer, Chief Solution Architect of Public Sector at Intel, and welcome to Embracing Digital Transformation, where we investigate effective change leveraging people, process, and technology. On today's episode, the myths of lift and shift to the cloud with special guest John Evans, Chief Technology Advisor at WWT. John, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you for having me. It's my pleasure.
Hey, you come highly regarded from someone that left WWT and came to Intel, and that's Hannah.
Oh.
I know you know who Hannah is, and we're glad we have her. Sorry, we stole her from you, but we're happy to have Hannah on our team. So a shout out to Hannah on that one.
Absolutely. She definitely deserves it. I'm still a little bitter. I'm totally kidding. But no, Hannah is awesome. I totally concur there.
Great. So, John, tell us a little bit about your background and your history, how you got involved in technology and all that.
Okay. So, been involved in technology for about 20 years now. Started actually during college in a help desk. So I think that's not an uncommon start for a lot of technologists starting off in help desk. But yeah, started off doing tier 1 support in a major defense contractors help desk, their internal help desk, and then just started moving on from there. Moved that into a NOC as a service type of position. Started getting more into the cybersecurity side, the enterprise architecture side. Worked for DISA for a few years as a contractor, helping to architect the DoD, the DISA cloud. I was one of the lead architects for that, and then eventually came to the state of Maryland, where I was brought in to lead the cloud migration and digital transformation efforts for the state. They became aware of the work I had done on the DISA cloud, so they brought me in to help out with their cloud. And after a few years of doing that, I transitioned to the state CISO position. So got to see at a high level, got to do the operations side as well as the security and governance side. And then about 3 years ago, I left government service and came over to WWT, and it's been awesome here since.
So are you still doing a lot in the public sector with WWT? I mean, because your whole career has been in the public sector.
Yeah, absolutely. Work primarily in state, local, and education. Help out a little bit in some other areas of public sector, but I've really kind of focused more on the state, local, and education over the last year or so. Like I said, still help out in some other areas, things like, zero trust roadmaps, coming up with the WWT sort of way of doing things in cyber consulting, some of those types of initiatives that are kind of crossing the different verticals within public sector. I still help out with those as well.
You know what? We're going to have to, I can already tell you have to come back on the show and talk about security. Since you were a CISO, we're going to have to do that, but not today. Okay. Today we're doing lift and shift, the myth of lift and shift. You've done several cloud migrations, it sounds like.
I've been very involved in 2 very large ones. So if you think of the Department of Defense cloud,
yeah, that's a huge one.
And then state of Maryland is I just learned this actually about a couple months ago, talking to one of the major cloud service providers, that the program I led at Maryland is still the largest cloud migration ever to be done across state, local education. So,
wow, that's amazing.
Yeah. So two pretty big ones.
All right. So a lot of people, we all want to hear, how that went, right? And we named the episode today the myths of lift and shift. I've seen this myself. I've helped some organizations go through this migration, and the way that cloud is sold initially was just move your workloads, just move everything, right? And so what have you found? Well, I mean, let's start off right at the beginning with that first. What's the first myth?
So I think that there's kind of 4 major lifts, I guess, but let's start off with the first one being cloud's cheaper. It's not necessarily. When you lift and shift, a lot of the times your applications were built for an on-premise environment, so there was no issue with things like auto scaling. They didn't have to be um, developed with some of these cloud concepts in mind. Some of these more of consumption based concepts in mind. So when you think about auto scaling, that wasn't something that was built into a lot of your legacy applications. So and and a lot of the I don't want to mention any names of products, but there's products out there that will help customers or help organizations move an application into the cloud. The majority of those products don't support auto scaling either. So what you've got is when you move your application into the cloud, you now have to be max provisioned at all times. Um, Being max provisioned at all times means a lot more money, which um, doesn't often translate into cost savings, especially if you've already paid for a server, you've already paid for whatever environment you're hosting that application in. Now you move it into the cloud, you're having to max provision at all times. You're not able to auto scale. So you're not really making use of a consumption based model, which is the main cost savings mechanism in the cloud. And now customers are actually paying more than they were for the same capability on premise.
I have a great example that I was doing work in the Canadian government, and this was at the early days of them using the cloud, and they moved an SAP instance into the cloud, an SAP instance that they ran 24/7 in their data center, and they moved it into the cloud, same thing, max provisioned, running 24/7 in the cloud, and they blew through their budget, just blew through it. Right in like 6 months, the year budget completely blew through it, and they were complaining back to the cloud service provider, what in the world is going on here? And they quickly learned that, well, that instance did not need to be running 24/7.
Mm-hmm.
They only really needed it 16.5 and maybe even down to 14.5. I think they finally got it down to 14.5. So they actually turned it on and off every day.
Yeah.
Which it sounds silly, but it saved them gobs of money. So you're right. It's a different mentality because the cost is consumption based, which is a completely different model than what we're used to in our data center. It's sunk cost in our data center, right?
Yeah. Well, and if you think about health and human services, which is typically the largest, I would say, IT budget within state government. If you just think about that, we can't turn off a lot of the access to these services. Applications for eligibility services, as a for instance,
Right.
can't turn them off at certain times a day. They have to be available all the time. But if you're able to auto scale, I mean, you could bring that down to the smallest instance, probably that a cloud service provider, a CSP, offers. In those off hours. So it's still running, it's still there, it's still available if somebody needs it, but you're hardly running through any money at all. Whereas if you're not able to auto scale, you're not coming down to that small instance. So now you're having to run at that large size, even in those hours where nobody's using it.
So is that the main saver, or is that the main thing that helps realize that cloud is cheaper? Is understanding the consumption model and changing your operations and or your application to fit that model better, or are there other factors that are contributing to your bill?
So there's others, but that one's probably the easiest to talk through, and
Gotcha.
it's arguably the largest cost savings mechanism, is that auto scaling, the consumption based model. Other things that you can consider that I would say you could put into that same bucket are some of the cloud native services. So each of the cloud providers, each of the CSP offers services that now in most organizations are being fulfilled by some third party application, some OEM product. Now, if you move into the cloud, you'll typically get a cost savings for a similar type of capability. They typically, most of the CSPs offer some of those capabilities at a price that would be less than if you were to go to a third party vendor, an OEM, whatever you were
And
doing
run it
in
yourself.
your on premise environment. And a lot of times it'll be managed or in some at some level managed by the CSP. So there's the potential there to take some work off of your workforce also. So there's a lot of attractive pieces to doing that. Part of the problem, there's a couple problems with that. One is, again, a lot of these legacy applications, they're not developed to be able to leverage some of the cloud native applications. So you won't be able to do everything that, you read a white paper maybe and says how great the CSP offering is. Your application may not be able to consume that. The other issue there is lock-in. So if you use those services quite a bit, it's very easy to get locked in to that specific cloud. If you need to, for some reason, whether it's cost, whether it's licensing, you need to move your application now to another cloud environment. Just say, and not trying to say one's better than the other by any means, but let's say you need to move from AWS to Azure. If you've used a whole bunch of AWS services, it could be very difficult for you to extricate your application, break all the ties with those services, move to Azure. But the same is exactly true moving from Azure to AWS. So I was just using the
Right. No, it's that typical vendor
yeah.
lock-in thing that people worry about, right? And it's real in the cloud for sure.
It's probably
Right.
more so. It's more of a concern, I would say, in the cloud than I've seen it be in the past, because you can leverage so many services across so many different areas of your stack.
You know what it kind of reminds me of? It reminds me of the server wars in the 90s and early 2000s. Do you remember that? You had to compile your code for Solaris or AIX or HPUX. And then Linux came along and rattled everyone's cages. And now we don't worry about stuff like that
Yeah.
at all in the data center. So I'm wondering, do you think we'll ever get to the point where the cloud service providers aren't relying on proprietary SaaS offerings that lock people in? Do you think the people will get frustrated enough where they move to, like what happened with Linux? Linux was just earth shattering to all these big companies that had these proprietary operating systems.
Yeah. I don't know that the CSPs will want to do that, only because
Well, yeah.
if I'm locked into your environment, I'm going to keep paying you my consumption costs. So it's sort of, that's why they offer it at a lower cost, is to get you locked in.
Is to get you locked
Yeah.
in.
So
Yeah.
that you're then going to continue paying consumption costs to them and not move off to another cloud. So they almost sort of, I would guess,
They're
I
like
don't
a
know
drug
any
dealer. Let's
vendor, but
just say what it
yeah.
is.
Okay. Well, they probably,
They want to get you hooked. Of course they do. I mean,
yeah,
this is a normal
yeah,
business model, right? I'm going to entice you with better services at a lower price to get you locked in so that you can consume additional services,
yep, yeah,
right? But you still bring back the point that sometimes your legacy applications that maybe you can't afford to update, you can't afford to what's the right word? You can't afford to replace. That may prevent you from actually moving to the cloud and or using some of these services because of the cost.
I would say good. I would say don't move into the cloud unless you can do it the right way. And I think that's part of why,
Oh,
we want to call it, that's part of why, this is maybe called the myth of lift and shift. If you're not able to move into the cloud for whatever reason, if you're not able to do it the right way, take a good hard look in the mirror and say, why am I moving into the cloud? Why am I, what is my reason for doing this? Maybe you have, legislation that says that you have to move into the cloud or we have to be out of a data center. Okay, well that's a good reason.
that's a pretty big motivator right there.
That's a great reason. But if it's just to say that you're in the cloud,
Not a good reason.
not a good reason. You're probably going to end up costing yourself more. You're probably going to end up frustrating both your superiors and your workers because the strategy hasn't been fully thought through.
Let's talk about technical
Sure.
debt. This is a good one.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, because I'm seeing this in huge droves, right? Um, it's a big problem.
Absolutely. And people think a lot of times that by moving into the cloud that they're going to fix their technical debt or eliminate their some portion of their technical debt. Doing a lift and shift doesn't eliminate your technical debt in almost any case. um,
Doesn't it actually expose it more?
100%. That was going to be the next point. It can expose it more and accelerate it even.
Oh wait, explain it. I understand the expose because I'm now taking something that's been running for 30 years and moving it into a new environment. I am going to find exposure points. But what's the acceleration part? I don't.
Well, I think it's kind of the same concept. Is um, when I think we're kind of saying the same thing. You know, by
Okay, gotcha.
you're exposing it, but I guess what I was, the other, so by saying that it's accelerating it, it's you've now you have more technical debt to sort of worry about. So whether you look at that as more technical debt being exposed or whether it accelerated your technical debt, either way, you have more technical debt to kind of worry about in some of those cases.
All right, let's walk through an example because I think some of the people hear that word technical debt. I think they know what it is, but let's walk through an example. What would be a good easy case to understand? So I can look and see if I'm having the same issues.
So you move into, well, so first of all, technical debt is uh, often sort of the, I guess, colloquial kind of term for systems that are kind of falling behind what they should be. So when you're not making updates to your system, when those systems, I mean, when I came into the state of Maryland, as a for instance, we had systems that were still running on green screens, where
VT1
yeah,
VT100 terminals,
yeah,
huh?
the operators were they would hit whatever code 5 or something, and it would bring up a new screen, and like there was no navigation that was happening there. For people who had been using that system for 10 years, it was super easy for them to navigate. For someone just coming into the system, I sat down at a terminal one day. I couldn't figure out how to make anything work on this thing. Like, and then and the book is this thick, to learn all the commands and everything. So, not a super great user experience there, and a super steep learning curve there. So, um, that
But
obviously,
I want to stop you
yeah,
for a second there. But it's working.
that's, well, it's working for those people who've been there 10 years.
Oh, gotcha. But what's the danger in carrying technical debt like that? I mean, it works,
Well,
but I mean, what's the downside of it?
so anytime I have to bring in somebody new in, it's a lot of training to get them brought up to a speed. There's a lot of downsides. One of the downsides that people don't often think about, especially when you're talking about in a government space, is employee retention. So, millennials, any of the newer generations, I guess, that are coming into the workforce, which is, you want to have someone who is knowledgeable on the latest trends and developments around casework, as a for instance. So if you're trying to attract those top caseworker talents out of school who are up on the newest knowledge, they're not going to want to come in and learn a green screen. They're not going to want to come in and deal with these legacy applications. So we were seeing a high amount of turnover of very qualified people coming in. After a couple of months, they're like, you know what, I've had enough of this. I'm washing my hands of this place. I'm out of here.
That is fast. I never would have thought. I never would have thought of employee retention with technical debt.
Yeah,
But that's an interesting correlation.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's
I
cool.
mean, it was one of our biggest issues in one of the agencies was the amount of people who were turning over, and um, uh, we think it was directly attributable to some of the technical debt that we had in some of our systems. Um, you know, when you have technical debt, also there's security issues.
I was going to think, yeah.
If I have an old legacy application that hasn't been updated, I mean, I saw this firsthand more times than I would like to think about. But I may not be able to apply patches to that system. There may be a fear that I'm going to break it. This is an outdated operating system that it's running on. I may not be able to apply patches. Therefore, I've got security vulnerabilities that I just have to accept until we can get out of that technical debt cycle.
As a CISO, that must have driven you crazy.
It did. Now, when I say I had to accept, we had a risk acceptance process where
Well,
the
of
head of the
course, yeah.
agency actually had to accept them, but it was still not a pleasant process
And
for
I bet not. Now, did you see a lot of that in the OT space in operational technology, or was this in your IT environment as
Oh,
well?
this was in the IT environment I'm talking about.
Oh
Yeah, no,
wow,
I'm talking.
because I've seen that a lot in the OT space. It's been doing that same job. That pump has been pumping water for
Mhm.
the last 30 years on a Windows 95 box. I'm not touching it. Never ever, right? I'll just keep it disconnected from the internet. That's kind of mentality of the OT guys. But in the IT space, that's a whole different beast.
Oh yeah, no, it was a real thing. We had applications that were running outdated operating systems, couldn't apply patches to them because it would break the system essentially. Um, so they just had to accept the agency had to accept the risk that something real bad may happen here.
What about cost? To maintain these legacy, this technical debt. The first thing that comes to my mind is COBOL systems. How much you have to pay a COBOL programmer to come and fix problems.
Oh yeah,
And we laugh about it, but there's a lot of COBOL out there still running. The IRS uses some, and I know a lot of other states are still using mainframes that run COBOL on them. Um,
yeah. So COBOL in itself, I mean, there's some things COBOL's really good at, and so it's not necessarily a bad language on its own. The problem is two things. One is the lack of talent out there around COBOL still. So now you're having to pay exorbitant prices to get someone in who understands it. But another big problem that relates back to technical debt is a lot of these systems. So again, I'm going to talk in the health and human services space because that's an easy example for me to give. But it happens across motor vehicle departments, happens in other places also. There's rule changes that come down either from the state legislature, maybe from the feds, from CMS, and they make tweaks to your eligibility programs. Very A very common reaction to that is for someone to sort of, or for an agency, I guess, to kind of bolt on, I'll say, a little bit extra code to account for these tweaks.
right.
So they're not actually really going in and fixing the system. They're essentially kind of adding on something a little bit extra that will achieve the required results. The problem with this is, and this relates back to the concept of technical debt, you end up with a ton of spaghetti code. And then so now when you do want to update your systems, there's no way to recreate these systems essentially. So it becomes this very daunting task to the point where it makes people almost want to continue in the technical debt cycle because they're like, well, I can't just I can't break this up. One of the common concepts now and around cloud is breaking up your system into modules, containerizing
Right. Yeah, I've heard that. Right. That's an
microservices.
approach.
The way
Yeah.
the spaghetti code is written now, I have no way typically of breaking these up into modules, breaking these up into microservices. So now I have to do all of it. I can't just pull out a little piece of it. And so that makes people even more hesitant to move towards this modernization effort um, because they've been doing things wrong for all these years. Now it's like when something does break, when there is the impetus for this change, it's even harder.
So that tells me I need to tell my kids to learn COBOL. They will have a job forever.
Well, I think the other option there is one of the other options there, and this is what we had to largely do in Maryland, you just essentially scrap the old program. You
Yeah, but aren't won't services go down for your constituents in that
you
case?
don't scrap it until you have a new program built to
Gotcha.
replace it.
Right.
But basically, you have to rebuild. You have to go back, look at the rules,
Go from scratch. You look at the
go
use
from
cases
scratch,
and go from
basically, and
scratch.
rebuild something new, and then you can scrap the old one.
That costs a lot of money.
It does. There's some. So, like when we did our cloud migration in Maryland, one of the reasons we started with Health and Human Services is because there's a lot of federal funding dollars out there to help with these migrations. So, what we were able to do, I mean, the program at Maryland ended up being about a $500 million program over the life of it, and it's not
Oh
done
my
yet.
goodness.
But it was paid for probably about 70% or more, probably more than that, 70 something percent by the federal government. So the state didn't have to put up nearly as much money for a lot of these activities. When you're updating a Medicaid system, as a for instance, when you're developing a Medicaid system, moving a Medicaid system into the cloud, the federal government typically pays for 90% of all the costs. So the state's only responsible for 10%. So if a state is doing this, if they're really thinking about costs and how to optimize their money, if you start in the health and human services space, you can get up to 90% of a lot of these activities paid for by the federal government. You can keep things like your cloud formation templates, some of your Terraform, so the templates for setting these things up, the governance structures, all those things are reusable across the entire enterprise later. So
Oh yeah.
you
So
don't,
you have reusability that you built in.
you have reusability.
Um,
You're paying for a fraction of what you would have to pay if, say, Central IT or maybe Department of Motor Vehicles or someone. I don't know what the match is on DMV, but if you start in another agency, you may have to pay significantly more out of your state funds than if you start on the health and human services side. So,
on health and
yeah.
this it makes a lot of sense, right? Because you also build up your muscle memory on how to do this sort of stuff, right? Which can be daunting, it sounds like.
A lot of people think that by moving into the cloud, well, the cloud is secure. I can move into the cloud, and that's going to make securing my applications easier. But that's not always the case either. It's very important. So AWS and all the CSPs have some version of it. I'm most versed in AWS, so that's where I have some of my certs. So it's easiest for me to talk about that in some cases. But they have what's called the shared responsibility model.
Yeah, they all have it.
Yeah,
They all
exactly.
have the model, but they differ. This is one thing that got me tricky.
Yep.
They differ just a little bit in each one. So there's this weird overlap, right? Where things are secure, but then there's this gap.
Yeah. Well, you have to be real careful. And that was kind of the point I'm making is you have to be real careful of understanding in each CSP, exactly to your point, it's a little bit different. So you have to understand exactly what you're responsible for in each of the CSPs and exactly what they're responsible for. And it doesn't just change by CSP. It changes by which services you're consuming in that
Yeah, it
in that
does. Yeah.
CSP. So it's very important that your security teams. It's almost more complex in some cases to figure out exactly what I'm responsible for, make sure that I'm staying on top of that versus what they're responsible for. It's almost like a racing matrix across the different CSPs and across the different products that you have. But if you don't keep up on that, you could have vulnerabilities out there where CSP knows that they're not responsible for it, but your team may not. So security in the cloud, it's not necessary. There's a couple things you don't really have to worry about. You don't have to worry about things like hypervisors and stuff like that in
Or even physical security.
physical security. Yeah. But it doesn't necessarily make it easier. It's still complex. You still have to be on the stuff that you're responsible for. And it can be difficult to know what you're responsible for at times unless you're well versed in cloud.
Have you ever taken the approach? Well, the security is ultimately your responsibility anyway. Have you ever run into in the case where you are stepping on the security measures of the cloud service provider? Are they ever in conflict? Have you run into that case?
I don't. I'm trying to think if I've ran into that. I can't think of where I've run into that. I have run into the reverse of that though, where someone thought the CSP was responsible for something, and it's
And
like,
they weren't.
no, you're responsible for that. If you give me enough time, I maybe I'll come up with an answer on that one. I just
I haven't heard of one
yeah.
either. I in my gut, I'm constantly thinking, well, ultimately I'm responsible anyway for security of my stuff. It's my stuff,
Mhm.
right? So maybe if I am a little overzealous and step on the cloud service providers a little bit, I think that might be okay because it's better to be a little over cautious than have a gap.
That, so
I
that
think I don't know. I this is
Well, so that makes a lot of sense. And if you have, I'm going to be a little bit specious here in the
no
reasoning
okay.
what I'm saying. But if you have unlimited funds, then that's a great approach.
Oh yeah, there you go.
If you have to make
Yeah, I don't have unlimited funds, so
if you have to make trade-offs and you have to prioritize, and
then you got to
there's
figure out
even
where.
cases that I could point to. I don't want to maybe reference anything directly because I don't know if that would be politically proper, but um, cases where if the risk of an incident was less costly than the risk of fixing that vulnerability, just let that
Then you take
vulnerability,
that risk.
just let it live.
You know what? That's a normal. That should be in your risk assessment plans that you do. That's part of a life of a CISO. So that tells me when you're moving to the cloud, it adds to your risk profile.
Mm-hmm.
Most definitely, right? And you said it's more complex. I totally agree with you there. And in fact, people said, "Oh, the cloud is easy." Not easier than just running, because it's so much easier if I just run everything in my own little data center and I'm not connected to the internet, right? I mean, security's easy, my cost model's simple, but I can't grow. I can't grow. I can't provide services to my constituents. I can't satisfy mission needs, all those sorts of things. So we're living in this complex world. We have to understand that migration to the cloud is complex.
Absolutely. And I mean, when we were first moving into the cloud, both on the DoD side and in Maryland, um, I've got very specific examples where the security team would say, "No, you can't do that. You can't set the firewall rules to that." And it's like, well, you just don't understand the way that these concepts work in the cloud. It's not the same. So um, it's complex, and there's a knowledge gap a lot of times when you're first starting off moving into the cloud also. So that adds to some of the pain points also around that complexity.
So I think you just found a fifth myth. And it is, you need to skill up.
Yeah,
You
that's a
can't
great
just.
point.
I mean, you need to learn about it, right? That's something that you can't just. I think, and I will blame software developers. I am a software developer. I caused this problem. Inside Intel, I cause this problem too a lot, right? Oh, I can just spin up instances in the cloud. I can do whatever I want. I need to download things out of GitHub and you know out of all these other repositories where I'm just grabbing libraries to make things work. So I open up all the firewall rules because I'm too lazy to pick the right ports, right? So yeah, so I'm skilled enough to spin up an instance, but that's not the same,
I'm
right?
I'm glad you didn't work in. I'm just kidding.
Oh, believe me. I've interviewed our cloud broker team, and they go, "Yeah, we know who you are, Darren. We know exactly who you are." And they did wonderful things by putting security underneath me without me knowing
Yeah, and that's a great
in
way.
my own
Yeah,
instances. And there's so it's a different skill set. It's a different way of thinking of compute. And I think that's our number 5 is you have to change your mindset. You have to skill up on because these are different ways of doing compute than we've done in the past.
that's a great. What you were talking about there. It's a great example of how we need some different types of guardrails when you're moving into the cloud. There has to be, somebody shouldn't be able to from an enterprise managed cloud environment. They should not be allowed to go out and pull from whatever library they want to. They should be limited to be able to pull from certain environments.
John, you just scared every software developer
No, if,
out
if you
there.
need to have something, tell me and we'll approve it and we'll get it into the library. And then you can pull from that also. But
You're slowing me down,
I
John. You're
know,
slowing me
but you got to have
down.
security too. So
Oh, I know. I know.
it's,
I totally agree with you there. But I can tell you from my perspective, I'm like, then forget it. I'll just write it on. I'll just go outside of the corporate because that's where shadow IT came from,
100%. That's why people do it.
right?
People,
That's why people do it.
yeah.
Yeah. So
And
we've got to figure out better ways to manage, especially in today's world. Holy cow!
yeah,
The ransomware attacks, the cyber attacks, the sophistication of the attacks are outrageous.
Yeah, I mean, we had bots crawling the web looking for any sort of data that could be Maryland type of data, looking for, and we found a development environment in another country with an unlocked S3 bucket that was
Oh
some of our
gosh.
code. There wasn't any of our sensitive information in there. It was open source code, but it was code that we had adapted a little bit, so it wasn't as bad for us. Funny enough, though, there actually was another state's data um, in that bucket that they were using for test purposes. So some of our code base was in there. It was open source, like I said, so it wasn't hugely concerning from our perspective. But I had to call that other state CISO, who's since become a good friend of mine, and explain to him, hey, I think I found PII information of your citizens that they're running against our code base, like in order to validate.
How did that conversation go?
I got a colorful call on a Saturday morning as I was heading to breakfast. What are you doing with my PII? Yes, that was fun.
So this is John. This has been wonderful. Great information. Things we need to think about. So thank you so much for coming on the show.
It's my pleasure. I enjoyed talking with you, and looking forward to doing this again sometime soon.
Thank you for listening to Embracing Digital Transformation today. If you enjoyed our podcast, give it 5 stars on your favorite podcasting site or YouTube channel. You can find out more information about Embracing Digital Transformation at embracingdigital.org. Until next time, go out and do something wonderful.